Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. For those of you whom I may not have met in person or online, I'm Rick Lufkin, Chair of the Cardinal and Gray Society and proud member of the MIT class of 1968. Allow me to extend a personal welcome to members of both the Cardinal and Gray and Emma Rogers Societies to today's lecture from both me and my wife, Ruth, and express our thanks to you for joining us. While it has certainly been a joy to celebrate once again at in-person Cardinal and Gray events over the past few months, I am grateful that our community has been able to supplement those gatherings with online events like today's. We have more than 500 Cardinal and Gray members from all over the world registered for today's program, a testimony both to our guest speaker and our enduring bond as part of the global MIT community. We are excited to be partnering today with the MIT Press to share vital insights and discoveries from an innovative scholar and author. And now allow me to introduce our guest speaker, Tom Davenport, Distinguished Professor of Information Technology and Management at Babson College, MIT Press author, and Fellow of the MIT Initiative on the Digital Economy. Professor Davenport will be presenting on new perspectives on advancements in artificial intelligence. Tom will provide a short guide to the latest technologies and how companies can use them for business benefits and competitive advantage, plus new ways to harness AI in everyday life. And yes, you will have the opportunity to ask questions after his talk. Please join me in welcoming Professor Tom Davenport. Tom?
Thanks, Rick. I'm very happy to be here with you. And Rick told me that I'm the first non-MIT professor to present to this group, and I'm very flattered by that. As he mentioned, I do have some affiliation with MIT. I think I'm also a 1/10 lecturer in the executive education department at Sloan. I was admitted to Sloan many years ago, not quite early enough to make it into the Crimson and Gray Society had I gone there. The Cardinal and Gray Society, I keep doing that. Most of my graduate education is from up the river from MIT, so I keep sliding into that nasty word crimson. But I also have ancient family ties to MIT in that one of my ancestors, Charles Davenport, owned the land that became the current MIT campus. He tried to develop it into housing and businesses and failed, so MIT was able to get it at a pretty good price. So let me talk a bit about AI, and I'll share my screen so you can see my presentation. And I gather this will all be recorded, so some of my slides are a little bit wordy. I tend to be more of a wordy guy than a pictures guy, but maybe you can go back if you care enough to see them all. So I had a little bit of a dilemma. I've written 5 books on AI, and 2 of them have been with MIT Press. I've also, the most recent one, however, has been with Harvard Business Review Press, and so I'll sort of have a mixture of the content from those books. And much of what I'm going to talk about is too new to have been in any book, this idea of generative AI. So I think I would be remiss if I didn't mention the thing that people are excited about more than any other aspect of AI. So I'll spend some time talking about ChatGPT and the like. So a little bit of background, if I'm sure the Cardinal and Gray Society has higher technical abilities than just about any group I speak to. And so I find it useful to realize that there are really only 3 types of machine intelligence. Of course, all of them strung together with computer science and programming. There's logic, which Rick has reminded me a couple of times was the primary type of machine intelligence in the last round of AI. I was working for a consulting firm an IT consulting firm in Kendall Square at the time, and we spun out a company. I think the Mr. Morse, the alumnus from MIT and member of the Cardinal and Gray Society, was a member of that spin out company, a company called Applied Expert Systems, intended to do financial planning with AI. And like many of the other companies in that space, it proved hard to scale that technology. So you see the arrow is kind of a slow down slope. There are a number of companies who still have this technology in place, contrary to popular opinion, but more data-based, more machine learning-based tools have pushed logic-based systems kind of out of the way. MIT also has a long history of linguistics-based intelligence, and looking at the structure and relationships of language as a tool to understand at least that aspect of the world. And there's still some elements of that in some natural language processing and chat programs. We have lots of theory about how it works, much of it coming from Noam Chomsky, the famous MIT professor. And we can, as with logic-based systems, we can interpret what's going on more readily, but they just didn't prove to work very well. And there was this famous computational linguistics expert who said, every time I fire a linguist, the performance of our speech recognition system goes up. And that's been sort of true throughout history. What has really prospered is statistically based machine intelligence. And that's what's behind all of the modern advances in machine learning, in deep neural networks, and natural language processing, and generative AI. In fact, I tell some of my MBA students, some of whom are not quite as technical as the average MIT graduate, I say, if you paid attention in statistics class and you understand what regression analysis is, even the most complex deep learning model, even generative AI models are basically, trying to minimize the errors between data points and the lines or curves that describe them. And so if you understand regression analysis, you can really understand almost any form of AI. These tools are very powerful, very good at prediction. Obviously, they're using data to understand the world, which is often better than human logic or linguistics. However, they tend to require a lot of data. Sometimes it needs to be labeled where we kind of know the outcome to train the model. Difficult to interpret for these very complex deep learning models. For example, many layers of parameters, and they're not causal. Correlation is not causality, and so we really sometimes mistake a statistical relationship with a causal one. Interestingly, we can take those three underlying tools and make a lot of different AI methods and applications out of them. I won't go into all of the details, but if you wanted to, you could trace the relationship between that underlying source of machine intelligence and the methods and applications that sit on top of them. But as I suggested, more and more of those higher level applications and tools are based on statistics for database predictions. We can kind of look at contemporary AI as a kind of nested set of capabilities. The outermost box, if you will, is all the tools that make up artificial intelligence, expert systems based on rule engines and computational linguistics and some optimization tools. But machine learning is now the bulk of artificial intelligence approaches. And that, as I said, is all statistics based. Neural networks are just a form of machine learning that kind of act at a very high level, like neurons in the human brain. They have nodes and they have connections between the nodes and they have inputs and outputs. So it's a fairly simple kind of model, but companies started to realize, kind of contrary to some long ago predictions by a couple of MIT professors, that you could pile these neural networks up into very complex deep learning models. And that ended up rejuvenating contemporary AI. And generative AI is just a form of deep learning model. I'll say more about that, but they tend to be extremely complex and deep and use massive amounts of data to make predictions about what's coming next in a sequential data structure. Okay, so where is AI in the enterprise in late 2023? This is the kind of analysis that I did a few years ago with an MIT Press book that I wrote about AI in the enterprise. Now, I'd say at least 60 to 70% of large companies are doing something with AI, and probably now that we have generative AI, closer to 80, 85%. A few of them are all in on AI, which is the title of my latest book, but most are still just experimenting with AI, and that's a bit unfortunate. There aren't that many all in on generative AI companies yet. As I will describe later on, I have a very recent survey that I just did with the MIT Chief Data Officer and Information Quality Symposium, and not very many companies even have generative AI systems in production. Contrary to what a lot of people think, AI has existed for a long time, as Rick keeps reminding me, and even today, a lot of organizations seem to think that ChatGPT is sort of all that matters in terms of AI. But I keep telling the companies that I work with, look, you probably have a lot of structured data, rows and columns of numbers, and traditional machine learning, or classical machine learning, if you will, we don't have a good name for it yet, is probably going to be even more valuable to you than generative AI, as sexy as that might be. There have been challenges in getting these systems into production deployment at times. It's easier to experiment than it is to integrate an AI system with your existing technology infrastructure, to upskill the people who are going to be using it, to change your business processes around it. So production deployment is difficult, and companies have struggled with it, although, as I say, that's the way you get economic value from AI. Most of the usage has been tactical rather than strategic. I'll say more about that. Automation is something that the press really worries about a lot. However, not much of it has happened yet in companies. And what is much more common is the phenomenon of humans working alongside AI. And that was the subject of a book that I published last year with MIT Press with Steve Miller, called Working with AI. It's 29 examples of people who work with AI on a day-to-day basis. One of the things I pointed out in my previous book with MIT Press, called The AI Advantage, is that low-hanging fruit projects tend to be a lot more likely to succeed than the big moonshots. Even for the most successful and technologically oriented companies on the planet, Amazon.com, for example, they've had one or two moonshots that have been successful, but mostly they've been successful with, as Jeff Bezos put it, machine learning applications that quietly but meaningfully improve core operations. And there's a slow movement toward democratization of these tools, of data science, of automation. You may have heard about the low-code, no-code movement. This is what I'm working on for my next book. My co-author came up with a great title, All Hands on Tech. And that's what we're seeing in many organizations, including with tools like machine learning. There's a whole area of technology called automated machine learning that makes it accessible to amateurs, if you will, rather than professional data scientists. And these generative AI tools are also pretty amazing in terms of the machine learning analyses that they can do. There's something called advanced data analysis that is a subset of GPT-4, and I really encourage you to try it out if you're statistically minded. So how aggressively are companies embracing AI? As I mentioned, there are these all-in on AI companies, but they're a pretty small percentage. I do an annual survey with Deloitte, and we found that the population of large companies sort of splits into 4 categories, mostly a quarter or so each. So about a quarter are just getting started, don't really have AI use cases in production deployment at all, and of course aren't getting value from them as a result. There are the underachievers who have some use cases in production deployment, but don't feel like they're getting much value yet. And then, you always want to be on the top of these matrices. So the path seekers are organizations that don't have a lot of production applications yet, but feel like they're getting a high degree of value already. And the transformers are the companies that are really getting value out of a fairly substantial number, 4 to 7 or more production applications. So this suggests that for most companies, we're still at a pretty early stage in terms of production deployments. But what you find is that the companies with the high degrees of outcome, the path seekers and the transformers, are doing things differently. They're much more likely, more than 3 times as likely, to be opening up new markets and segments for their products and services, or developing new products, programs, and services with AI, or even enabling an entirely new business model, new ways of making money. So I encourage the companies that I work with, don't just try to optimize your existing business, try to think about how you can transform it in substantial ways with AI. That's what these all-in on AI companies are really doing. They have AI across the company, sometimes even thousands of systems in production deployment. And I'm talking about legacy companies, not Google or Meta or something like that. These are companies that have transformed themselves from, a traditional bank or insurance company or aircraft manufacturer into an organization that really has AI at the core of what they're doing and, making big bets on it. They're using AI to reimagine the way they do their work, not just kind of optimizing it incrementally. They have many employees who are fluent in AI, including a lot of data scientists and how it can be applied. They have a lot of data. Data is the fuel of AI. They've made a long-term commitment and are spending, in some cases, billions of dollars on AI for some large banks, for example. They have some framework for ethical and trustworthy AI in place. I just sent off to MIT Sloan Management Review today an article on Unilever and how they are using AI ethics, not just in a kind of pronouncements and policies way, but really evaluating every use case to make sure that it is ethically sound and that it works the way it's supposed to. They call the whole process AI assurance. And of course, you need leadership and management for this, a governance structure, and those all-in companies have that as well. So despite a lot more investment in AI, this is another company that I do some work with called New Vantage Partners, and they do an annual survey of large companies, mostly in the US and Europe. And they're spending more on AI. They say they're getting value. They've established a chief data officer or chief data and analytics, or now even chief data analytics and AI officer, which makes for a mouthful, even in an acronym. However, they are not really changing their cultures. 24% say that their organization is data driven. Even less say they have a data culture. And if you ask 80% of them what's holding them back, they say it's not technology that's the problem, it's people, process, culture, and organization kinds of issues. So, I know those get studied at MIT as well, even though it's primarily a technology-oriented institution in the name even. But those soft issues, as I think you probably all learned in your careers, can often be what separates successful implementations of a technology and unsuccessful ones. Okay, so I mentioned these all-in companies. They're trying to do 3 different categories of things. Some are trying to create new business models and products and services, as I said, which I think is maybe the most interesting objective. Some are trying to transform their business processes, not just improve them, but transform them. And some are trying to create even new customer behaviors with AI. We've seen social media create some new customer behaviors that are not so positive, social polarization and so on. But these companies are trying to create positive customer behaviors. So let me get into this idea of generative AI, because I think everybody is interested in that and how it's being applied. As I said, we don't really have all-in companies on generative AI, but just before this call, I co-founded an organization called the International Institute for Analytics, and we give an annual award for the best analytical outcomes in companies. And all 3 of the semifinalists, which were Charles Schwab and John Deere and Steelcase, were using some form of generative AI to begin to transform their relationships with customers and so on. So generative AI, as I mentioned, these are machine learning systems and very complex ones that generate content based on patterns in previously created sequential content. So words in text documents are sequential. Images can be viewed sequentially. This is an image from a generative AI system called DALL-E 2 that comes from OpenAI. I think I said, give me a scary picture of Pandora's box being opened. But those aren't the only types of sequential data. Pharmaceutical companies are finding that amino acids and proteins are also sequential in the molecules that are created to help treat disease. So we can use this technology for all sorts of predictions and pattern analyses in different forms of sequential content. Some people think these systems are sentient. They're not. It's just statistical prediction. I suppose that some cognitive scientists have said, maybe that's the way our brains work on the basis of statistical prediction, but nobody thinks that's very likely. Is it AGI or artificial general intelligence? Well, the consensus seems to be no, although there are no official criteria for when that test will be passed, but it does seem to be a big step toward it. It can clearly address many different topics and modalities: text, image, music, etc. Some people think of it as magic. It's not quite magic, although it does generate surprising results and is really impossible to fully explain. I think of it as if some alien beings have dropped this box on our planet Earth, and it has a box in front for inputs and a box out back for outputs. And we're just still trying to figure out what the heck is in that box and how does it actually work. So it does feel sort of magical at times. Massive amounts of commercial potential. I'll talk about that more later, perhaps more than any other previous form of AI, which is part of the reason why people are so excited about it. Will it wreak havoc on our society? Well, I don't think it's going to create killer robots that will wipe out human beings, but I do worry about this misinformation issue. And one commentator called it a potential thermonuclear bomb of misinformation. We haven't really seen too much in the way of problems from that yet, but I suspect we will see some of that going forward. So of course, ChatGPT is the best known of these. By the way, I think I asked DALL-E 2 to tell me what DALL-E 2 looks like in the style of Matisse, and this is the image that it came up with. But there are lots of other ones. The Schwab people I mentioned earlier started out using BERT, which was one of the earlier versions of this from Google. There's Lambda, Bard, Llama, Bloom, lots of strange names from different organizations. More and more companies are entering this space. I think eventually there are going to be many, many of these foundation models, as they're sometimes called, and then different set of models, some from the same vendors, some from different vendors for text-to-image capabilities. We're really just getting started with this. In fact, the first paper on it was published in 2017. It was a paper from a number of Google researchers called "Attention is All You Need." Of course, that took a while for those models to start coming into the marketplace, but now they're coming at a very fast and furious level. They will be or already are embedded into virtually everything we do online. So search is going to be transformed. It already is being transformed. Writing emails for us, creating presentations, doing coding, of course, writing, composing, etc. At the moment, these technologies require human prompting on the front end and human editing on the back end. They make mistakes, as you probably all know, or often called hallucinations. They require a prompt to get something out of them, through that slot in the magic box that the aliens dropped on us. However, some people argue that, prompt engineer is going to be the job of the future, but there are already AI systems that will engage in a dialogue with you to create better prompts. And so I think prompt engineer is just going to be one of those many jobs that computers can do better than humans at some point. I don't think it's going to be very, very long. Now, these models are foundational in that they are intended to be for everybody, kind of a foundation for other types of learning and knowledge. And I think one of the most valuable things will be embedding company-specific, organization-specific content within these systems. Companies' proprietary knowledge, legal briefs for law firms, protein analysis for pharmaceutical firms, and so on. So I'll say a little bit more about that later on and give some examples. So how does this technology work? I am not a computer scientist or even a data scientist. I was trained as a sociologist originally, although I did do a lot of statistical computing work, but I think I can explain at least to some degree how it works. These are machine learning models, as I say, trained on very large volumes we've never seen of data. GPT-4, 13 trillion or so tokens. Maybe you split that in half for the number of words. A token can be 1 or 2 words typically. So that's just a vast amount of knowledge, basically much of the internet and many books. Lots and lots in the trillions in GPT-4 of parameters. We've never seen that before. These are possible variable values of all of or feature values. We call them features typically in machine learning. And the way they work is they're just, making predictions of the next thing in a sequence, the next word or phrase based on what other documents have used in books and the internet, or the next set of pixels based on what pixels have been in works of art or photographs on the internet. One of the things that was new is, we can always just predict the next word, or for a number of years we've been able to do that, but this attention mechanism looks at different words in the same sentence and can establish context. So we know that, the word bank, for example, can be a financial institution or a hill, or you can even, counting on something, banking on something. It can determine what really the context is and make a prediction that is within that context. Of course, as I say, with a 1.75 trillion parameters, it's virtually impossible to understand why a generative model says what it does or predicts the image that it does that you want. And while it reproduces patterns of words and images and relationships, it doesn't reproduce specific text or images. So that's what makes it so challenging from a legal standpoint. You've already had a number of authors and artists sue the companies in this generative AI vendor space for violating their copyright. But my sense is they're not going to be terribly successful just because we're not reproducing specific text or images. So my guess is fair use copyright legislation is going to prevent successful lawsuits in that regard, although I'm not an attorney, of course, either. So there's a whole structure to this industry. There are the chip providers, NVIDIA, making a lot of money producing these graphics processing unit chips that are useful for AI and generative AI in particular. Turns out they also turned out to be useful for cryptocurrency mining, and their original purpose was video display. And now other companies, Google and TSMC, the Taiwan semiconductor manufacturing company, are getting into either designing or producing these things. Google actually has a partnership with NVIDIA to help design its next generation of chips. There are cloud computing services that make available these generative models, the three big ones being Amazon and Microsoft and Google. There are these large language model proprietary vendors. Google has them, OpenAI in a partnership with Microsoft has them. Metas are mostly open source now. Cohere and Anthropic are a couple of other companies, Cohere, a Canadian firm, and Anthropic trying to emphasize the safety of their AI language models. Then there are the image model providers, a large group of open source model providers, including one from the UAE called Falcon that is quite powerful. Then you have companies tuning models for specific purposes, tuning them in a variety of ways, sometimes through prompts and sometimes through actually retraining the models with different parameters. Jasper is one for marketing, Harvey for legal capabilities, Grammarly for writing, Arteria for financial services documents, and there are really hundreds more. Platform services that help you create and use these models effectively, and then software vendors building generative AI interfaces into their products. And I think basically everybody will have that at some point. So it's a pretty complex stack, if you will, and a lot of companies involved, a lot of money to be made. At the same time, I think clearly a lot of these companies will not survive over the long run. So you probably know by now you can generate almost anything with generative AI, certainly lots of art and entertainment content. And, we know turns out my son and daughter-in-law are both Hollywood writers, and they were on strike about, in part, about the idea of using AI to write entertainment-oriented content, television and movie scripts and so on. They seem to have come up with at least a short-term, a 3-year agreement that satisfies both parties. But there are also all types of business content. So I was working with a company in the telecommunications equipment space, and they're doing FCC submissions, and some pharmaceutical companies are tinkering with FDA submissions, and certainly the Schwab and John Deere prize-winning entries in the contest that I was just emceeing are doing customer service-related responses, summarizing, capturing customer service content, and in some cases responding back to customers. Some lawyers are doing contracts, all sorts of personalization approaches in marketing, answers to technical questions for technology vendors and even for financial services firms. And then if you're writing product or ad copy, I think your job may not be long-lived, because these systems are really, really quite good at that. There are a lot of existing business applications. Heinz had an early one in the marketing and advertising space. Coca-Cola has done that too. Coca-Cola says it's used generative AI to even come up with a new formulation of one of its drinks. If you've ever tried to order a hamburger or coffee at McDonald's through their quite complex kiosks, you'll be relieved to know that they're going to substitute ChatGPT-like front end to those kiosks. It'll make it much easier to order. Mattel, and now even automobile companies, Mattel was doing it with Hot Wheels, and automobile companies with real cars are playing around with product designs with these image-related tools. I'll say more about Morgan Stanley managing its own internal knowledge. Allen and Overy is one of the early law firms to do legal capabilities, and now you've seen some of the early providers starting to be acquired by larger firms in the legal services and technology business. Communications of all types. I keep hoping that PR firms will personalize their pitches. I get a lot of them, and the vast majority are not personalized at all. A lot of pharmaceutical firms are playing around with this. Flagship Pioneering, the Kendall Square area, you may know, is a kind of combination venture capital private equity firm. It spun out Moderna. They are thinking that these tools can generate ideas for new molecules. Sanofi's CEO, one of the largest big pharma companies, just said, we're all in on AI. So I like that term, since I wrote a book by that name, and said we're going to really use it to dramatically change how we do creation of new drugs and compounds. Deloitte and a lot of other companies have been using it for coding, with acceleration of coding productivity by 50 to 60%. And as I say, it's really quite mind-boggling, the quality of the code. Somebody was telling me yesterday about someone who drew a little picture of a dog and a picture of a moon and said, create me a video game. I think he said this to OpenAI, one of OpenAI's tools. Create me a video game where the dog is trying to jump up and catch the moon. And when I press the space bar, the dog will jump up. And it produced that video game in a matter of seconds. Analytics and data science vendors are adding this capability, but I think the big challenge for them is going to be, you can get analytics and data science out of GPT-4. So it's, I think, really going to disrupt many categories of the software industry. So I mentioned, I'd say a little bit more about managing a company's own knowledge. Morgan Stanley is not the only one, but it's was one of the earlier adopters of this approach. But what they really wanted was for their financial advisors to have access to all of the company and business and investing oriented knowledge that they've accumulated. And so they started working with OpenAI a while ago, 2021. Schwab, as I mentioned, has a customer service system, and they started working on this 4 years ago. So some companies were really early adopters. Morgan Stanley's data scientists said, okay, we're not going to change the parameters of the model, but we're going to use something called prompt training. Now there's another acronym for that called RAG, or Retrieval Augmented Generation, where you basically you create embeddings, you turn text into numbers, you create a vector database, and then every time you submit a prompt, you compare that prompt to what's in the vector database, and you pull out the right content to help address the question in that prompt. You have to do that now because the slot that these aliens provided for us, it's often called the context window or the prompt window, doesn't allow for a lot of text. Morgan Stanley had 100,000 documents they were trying to include in this particular application, and you couldn't fit them all in at once. So they had to use this RAG-based approach. Now they've got the knowledge so that it can be loaded in. 300 people tested it. Now they're rolling it out to all of their 16,000 financial advisors. The model is only accessible to Morgan Stanley. So most large companies have versions of these tools. Morgan Stanley's using GPT-4 that are unique to them. So they don't have to worry about that content getting into the public model. And if you have your own content, if it's well curated and you control the types of prompts that people put in, make sure they're not asking, what's the meaning of life, or how can I get a date, or whatever, then you're likely to get very accurate responses. Hallucinations seem to be much less of a problem with these well-managed domain-specific content systems. So we're going to see this in a whole variety of industries. Marketing and advertising agencies are clearly going to be transformed. I think law firms, although not known for their rapid embrace of new technology, are going to be transformed. Software development, no doubt about it. Commercial artists, I worry about. Journalism was already facing lots of challenges. It's going to face even more because these systems can write quite impressive pieces of journalism content. Education, I think, is going to be transformed. I'm sure some people at MIT are working on that now in the digital learning organization. We at Babson are thinking about how's it going to transform business education. And despite these agreements in Hollywood that are being negotiated, I think it's really going to transform video and audio entertainment. So there are a whole variety of fields that are going to be transformed with this technology. There are problems, of course. I mentioned hallucinations. They're getting less and less. This lovely creature was created by DALL-E 2 as well. I forget what the prompt was, but kind of a scary outcome. We're still identifying behaviors that we didn't anticipate. Coding was not anticipated. Some systems have shown hostility if you use the wrong kinds of prompts, even threats of a type, offers of marriage from one to a New York Times reporter. As I say, lots of potential for misinformation and deepfakes. These systems historically were not up to date unless they were trained on up-to-date information, but they're more and more tying into search engines to be more up to date. If they haven't seen complicated math, they're not good at it, although they're APIs to better math tools. They can be unpredictable and unexplainable, as I said. They're not going to come up with novel content because they're trained on existing content, and there are many unresolved legal issues that are going to make their way through the courts for a long time. If I were advising my children now, I'd say go into intellectual property law. That's going to be really big for a while. And I think there are going to be multiple versions of these things. This is just in the law area alone. We're going to have foundation models and fine-tuned legal models, and the UK legal people are going to say, well, our law is different, so we need our own version. And the real estate lawyers are going to say, we need our own version. And the specific firms like Linklaters are going to say we have to have our own version of real estate law for the UK. So there are just going to be thousands and thousands of these models. And I think keeping track of them and making sure that they're updated is going to be the big challenge. So the world is going to change. Everybody's going to use this technology. We can't ban it. Regulation is going to have to come at some point. In the US, we have nothing now. We're going to see, what's called synesthesia, easy conversion from text to image and image to text and music to lyrics and lyrics to music and so on. It's going to be quite amazing. Foreign languages, I think, will not be much of a problem anymore. We'll be editors, not drafters of content. Systems will do the drafting, we'll do the editing. Data quality and curation will matter more and more. Somebody said that's the only moat. Watermarks of what is an AI-created image will become critical if we can establish it. Human-generated content may become more valuable. We may value it more. AI chips in our brains may be the next thing. Who knows? And I always think the only people who will lose their jobs to AI, at least in the short run, will be those who refuse to work with AI. If you embrace these technologies and use them well, I think you'll do fine. So with that, I will stop and see if Rick has any questions about these issues.
Thank you, Tom. That was a tsunami of information, and I think we're all, sort of overwhelmed and reeling by it. A couple of weeks ago at the Alumni Leadership Conference, one of the academics made a presentation, and he said that AI mimics rationality. Thought that was an interesting observation, is that AI systems are not rational per se, but they mimic rationality. And that's where they can get scary, because as you point out, it is impossible to fully explain how AI comes up with its answers.
Yes, and we can't really explain how humans come up with their answers sometimes either. So maybe there's more in common than we think.
A series of questions that our audience has provided us. Professor Davenport, between, say, ChatGPT and a respectable professor or professional, who would you trust more to arrive at a logical conclusion in reasoning, and why? I have some substantial experience with both and still can't tell the difference.
Well, it's interesting. Last Saturday, one of my students said that he had been experimenting with ChatGPT and in an area that a professor had been telling him about, and he felt like he learned more from ChatGPT. Now, I constantly tell my students that, look, you really need to verify the outputs of these systems. And in many cases, I'm afraid they don't. So I would say the potential for substantial error would probably be higher with those systems now, although that potential is decreasing over time. But the ability to sort of teach things in multiple ways, I think, is quite impressive. And some university is going to figure out how to use this really well. And hence, we may be able to quite substantially lower the costs of tertiary education. It's way too high in this country.
Thank you. Peter Rossow. Hi, Peter. Do generative AI systems consume unusual amounts of energy? Are there ecological impacts?
They do, and it's a bit unfortunate. I wrote a little article in Harvard Business Review with another researcher on how to make them greener. The creation of these large-scale models is extremely energy consumptive. The inference of them, that's the use of them to answer a particular question or respond to a particular prompt, not that incredibly huge, except we're doing it so often now that it adds up very quickly. So I think at the rate we're going, these models get bigger and bigger. AI generative models may end up consuming about as much energy as some decent sized countries, which is, I think, quite unfortunate. We need to figure out how to shrink them down and make them less energy intensive.
There's been a lot of discussion in the media recently about Bitcoin and how all the energy being consumed by virtual currencies. So that is an issue that the world really hasn't even wrapped its brain around yet to be presented. Tom Mikas asks, why do some AI generated images depict people with extra fingers and disconnected limbs?
Well, I gather that they are getting better at that, but some of the early models just didn't have good algorithms for predicting that level of detail in the image. But we have something called human reactions to these systems. And so the good companies are testing their systems through human assisted reinforcement learning and saying, okay, let's identify the problems that they create, the toxic language they create, and so on, and fix the algorithms whenever we can to avoid that going forward. And I think, continue to see a lot of that.
Paul Ackman asks, I get that it is impossible for humans to figure out how or why generative AI does what it does. Can AI explain how AI generates output? My guess that is that it's impossible for humans to determine whether the explanation is legit or an AI hallucination. The logic gets circular here.
Yeah, that is generally true. In these systems that are trained on a smaller body of content, you can usually get it to point to the particular document from which it created that knowledge. So the Morgan Stanley system that I mentioned earlier, it will say, this came from this analyst report by such and such a person on such and such a date, and you can go back to it. But the large, petabyte, trillions of words systems, yes, it's very difficult to know reliably where the information came from.
John Day asks, how do you build ethics into AI?
I think that, as I suggested earlier with regard to Unilever, it's quite important to look at each individual use case and say, is that consistent with our values? Is that somewhat transparent in terms of how it came up with its answer? Is it biased in some way in terms of the training data that was used to create it? I think it's very important to do it application by application or use case by use case. That's the only way to really address the issue. And then, some of the generative models are much better tested than others. Meta, for example, has said it hasn't used any of this human feedback to train their open source models. So chances are quite good that it will be, a bit more toxic and not something that you want to reveal to your customers or your families.
Maria asks, how might AI be applied to the Internet of Things?
Well, that's a very good question. And it takes me back to this idea that generative AI is not the most valuable form for everybody. So AI in the form of more traditional machine learning is already being applied a lot to the Internet of Things. The Internet of Things generates a lot of sensor data, typically about some state of the world in a machine or a valve or something along those lines. And you can do all sorts of predictive models of when it's likely to fail or when it already is failing, generating some anomalies. And AI is quite useful in that regard already. It's kind of gotten lost in the shift to ChatGPT and the like.
Ron Randall, how can we use and control watermarks to guarantee source identification of text, sounds, or images?
Well, that's a really tough problem, and I'm not an expert in it, but I know that on a couple of occasions I have inadvertently edited out the DALL-E 2 watermark at the bottom. It was just as easy as cropping any other image. So I think there will always be challenges in preventing people from eliminating the watermark or putting in a watermark where it shouldn't really exist. Right now, I think we're a long way from making that a viable option for identifying when something is AI generated. And in text, it's really impossible, because the idea behind text generation is you're supposed to edit it anyway. And so does that make it watermarked or not? The sad fact, however, is many people do not edit text. There was an early MIT study showing that the vast bulk of people found it more productive to generate marketing content with generative AI, but they did not edit it at all. And some of my students don't edit it at all either, I'm sorry to say.
Norm asks, will AI change the field of medical diagnostics?
Yes, I think it certainly will. And not so much these big general foundation models like GPT-4, but Google, for example, has a model that's specifically trained on medical knowledge called MedPalm 2. And it's already better than many physicians at passing medical exams, even though Google doesn't think it's quite ready for clinical application. It will be before long. And I think that'll be great. That'll be one of the great benefits of this technology. Yeah. It will make access to high quality medical knowledge much more democratized across societies and geographies and so on.
Mark Chan, how do you consider the recent introduction of quality control rules on generative AI by the Chinese government? Does it cater to the ruling party or general people?
I haven't reviewed them in detail, but as I understand, it is quite detailed. And it's one of the reasons why I haven't fully read it all yet. It only happened in the last couple of days. And I think it's a step forward, frankly. There may be something in there that leans toward preserving party rule, but in general, I think we need more regulation. And even the vendors are all saying, please regulate us, save us from ourselves.
Maria asks, what other categories of AI are there in addition to generative AI?
Yeah, well, there's traditional machine learning, but we don't have any name for it other than traditional or classic. There is the whole idea of a rule-based system based on logic. That's, as I say, still around. There are optimization-oriented systems that help you, optimize your ride home with Google Maps. Computational linguistics, which uses linguistics rules rather than statistics. So there's still a fair number, but generative AI is what's caught everybody's attention these days.
George Starkshaw asks, what is the difference between generative AI and artificial neural networks?
Generative AI is a form of artificial neural network. It is a very, very complex neural network, but it is a form of that basic AI architecture.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is now 1:59 and a half, and regretfully, all good things must come to an end. It's always thrilling when there's lots of questions still pending. My apologies to those who asked but who were not answered. This whole presentation will be available on a recorded version at the Cardinal and Gray website in about 2 to 3 weeks, sometimes longer. And right now, I just want to thank Tom Davenport profusely and profoundly. That was enlightening. I'm wondering about all of my friends in academia who spend their lives writing grant proposals. Perhaps this is a solution to grant proposals, because that's another lifetime.
So. Yeah. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and good afternoon. Thank you.